What happens when the same qualities that made a woman indispensable to a system become, in different political conditions, the qualities that make her dangerous to it? In the spring of 1536, the woman who had transformed the religious and political landscape of England, who had held the attention and the will of Henry VIII for nearly a decade, who had given birth to a future queen, was charged with adultery, incest, and treason, tried within days, and executed within weeks. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
The story of Anne Boleyn is often told as a story of ambition, seduction, and tragic downfall. It is something more specific and more instructive than that. It is a case study in how narrative is constructed by those who hold power, how institutions can be used to legitimize predetermined outcomes, and how the position of any person whose safety depends entirely on structures they do not control is never truly secure. Tonight we turn to a queen whose rise reshaped England, and whose fall reveals the mechanisms by which power disposes of those who have become inconvenient to it. The question is not whether Anne Boleyn was guilty of the charges brought against her. The evidence does not support guilt. The question is what the charges were for, and what that tells us about how power operates when it has decided that someone must be removed.
When power decides the narrative, truth becomes secondary. The trial of Anne Boleyn is one of the clearest demonstrations of this principle in English history. The outcome was determined before the charges were. The charges were assembled to justify the outcome. Understanding how this happened requires understanding the specific environment that made it possible.
We are speaking about Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, from 1533 to 1536, and about what her story reveals about the relationship between gender, power, and institutional violence in the Tudor court.
Her daughter Elizabeth became one of the most successful monarchs in English history. Her relationship with Henry reshaped the religious landscape of England and Western Europe. Her execution was accomplished through a legal process that historians have consistently found inadequate to the charges it purported to adjudicate. All of these things are true simultaneously, and none of them can be fully understood in isolation from the others.
Then let us begin with the court she entered, and the position she occupied before she became queen.
Anne Boleyn was born probably around 1501 or 1502, into an ambitious English noble family, with connections to both the English and European courts. She spent years in France, at the French court, and later in the service of Claude of France and Margaret of Austria, acquiring an education, a set of cultural references, and a sophistication in language and court culture that was unusual among the women of the English nobility. When she returned to England and took up a position at the court of Henry VIII in the early 1520s, she was a more fully formed and intellectually equipped figure than the standard image of a court lady suggests. Henry VIII at this point was a formidable and still physically impressive king in his 30s, married to Catherine of Aragon, and deeply concerned with the question of the succession. Catherine had produced only one surviving child, the Princess Mary. The need for a male heir was not simply a dynastic preference, it was understood as a political and national necessity, in an era when the stability of the realm was assumed to require a male sovereign. This structural pressure shaped every relationship at court.
Still, the question of succession was not a private matter. It was the organizing principle of Tudor political life.
Yes, and here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard account. Anne Boleyn is frequently presented primarily through the lens of her attraction to Henry, as though the 7-year pursuit that preceded their marriage was simply a romantic obsession that she encouraged or manipulated. The historical evidence supports a more complex picture. Anne was politically aware, theologically engaged, and culturally influential. She was associated with reformist religious ideas. She promoted humanist learning. She had clear views about what she wanted, and the intelligence to pursue them within the constraints available to her. Henry's pursuit of an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, which he pursued through the papal court from 1527 onward without success, eventually produced one of the most significant religious and political transformations in English history, when Rome would not grant what Henry required. The solution that emerged, partly through Anne's influence and that of her reformist allies, was to remove England from papal jurisdiction entirely. The Act of Supremacy of 1534 made Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. The English Reformation, in its institutional form, was partly a product of his relationship with Anne. Anne and Henry were married secretly in January 1533, after it became clear that she was pregnant. The marriage was publicly announced, and her coronation followed in June. In September of 1533 she gave birth to a daughter, the future Elizabeth I. Henry had expected a son. The birth of a daughter was a significant disappointment in a court organized around the dynastic necessity of male succession.
So from the moment of Elizabeth's birth, Anne's position was structurally weakened by the one thing she could not control.
Yes, and this is the turning point in understanding what happened to her. His illness. Between 1533 and 1536, Anne suffered at least 2 further pregnancies that did not produce a surviving child, including what appears to have been a male child who was miscarried in January 1536. Each failed pregnancy eroded her position within a system whose central requirement she was failing to meet. At the same time, Henry had begun showing interest in Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. The mechanism that was used to remove Anne was constructed rapidly and efficiently in the spring of 1536, primarily by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, who had his own political reasons for wishing to break the influence of Anne's faction at court. Within a matter of weeks, a set of accusations was assembled that Anne had committed adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, and that she had conspired to bring about the death of the king.
So the charges combined sexual disgrace with treason, targeting both her reputation and her legal standing simultaneously.
Yes. The charges of adultery with multiple men, including the specific charge of incest, were designed to be maximally damaging to her reputation in a culture that organized female worth around sexual virtue. The charge of treason connected to the alleged conspiracy against the king was the mechanism by which a death sentence could be reached. The combination was not accidental. It reflects a pattern of attacking women through sexual and moral allegations that serves the dual purpose of justifying their elimination and discrediting any future defense of their character. The evidence for the charges was thin to the point of non-existence. The men accused with her, including Mark Smeaton, a court musician who was the only one to confess, with a confession obtained under circumstances that strongly suggest torture or the threat of it, were tried and are tried, convicted on the basis of evidence that Eric Ives, the leading modern scholar of Anne's life, concluded was almost certainly fabricated. The speed of the entire process from the first arrests to Anne's execution was approximately 3 weeks.
So the entire process, from accusation to execution, was completed in a time frame that made genuine investigation impossible.
Yes, Anne was tried before a jury of peers that included her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presiding. She conducted her own defense with considerable composure and intelligence, denying all charges with specificity and consistency. She was convicted. The verdict had almost certainly been determined before the trial. The trial was not a process for establishing truth. It was a process for producing a legal record that justified an outcome that had already been decided. The specific role of Thomas Cromwell in the construction of the case against Anne deserves attention. Cromwell had been Anne's ally in the early years of the Reformation, but by 1536 their political interests had diverged. Anne favoured using the revenues of the dissolved monasteries for education and charitable purposes. Cromwell favoured directing those revenues to the crown and to political allies. Anne also opposed certain aspects of Henry's foreign policy. Cromwell had reason independent of Henry's personal desires to want her removed.
So the mechanism of her destruction was constructed by someone who had his own political interests in her removal, not only by Henry's personal desire to be free of her.
Yes. This is important for understanding the case clearly. Henry's personal desire for a new marriage created the space in which action against Anne was possible. Cromwell's political interests and organizational capacity provided the mechanism. The two did not need to consciously coordinate. Cromwell understood what Henry wanted and constructed the means of achieving it in a way that served both Henry's interests and his own. This kind of convergence of interests, where the person with the institutional power to construct the case is also a person with their own reasons for wanting the outcome, is a recurring feature of politically motivated legal proceedings. Anne's response at her trial has been documented in multiple contemporary accounts. She spoke clearly, denied all charges with specific detail, and maintained a composure that several observers noted with evident surprise. Her final speech before her execution has been preserved in multiple versions, though the precise wording is uncertain. What is consistent across accounts is that she expressed no admission of guilt for the charges brought against her, while also demonstrating the kind of public self-possession that the context of a scaffold required. She did not break.
So even at the end, she maintained the intelligence and composure that had characterized her throughout.
Yes, the religious and cultural significance of her contribution to the English Reformation is also worth underscoring. Anne was genuinely engaged with the reform movement in ways that went beyond political positioning. She owned and read William Tyndale's Obedience of a Christian Man, a text arguing for scripture in the vernacular and for royal supremacy over the church. She promoted reformist clergy and humanist scholars. Her influence on the direction of English religious life in the 1530s was real, even if it was exercised through her position rather than through institutional authority. The popular culture of the centuries after her death has consistently found Anne Boleyn's story compelling, and the reasons for that compulsion are worth examining. She's a figure who wielded genuine political and cultural influence without holding formal power, who was removed through a process of narrative construction rather than genuine legal adjudication, and whose daughter went on to achieve the kind of success that the system had denied to Anne herself. The story contains within it both the mechanism of gendered exclusion and its partial indirect transcendence.
So she's compelling because her story is both specific to its historical moment and structurally recognizable beyond it.
Yes, the mechanisms used against her, sexual and moral accusation combined with the use of institutional processes to legitimize a predetermined outcome, are not specific to the Tudor period. They are specific to the structural situation of a person whose power is contingent, and whose elimination requires a story that justifies it to an audience beyond those who have already decided on the elimination. That situation recurs in different forms, and recognizing its structure is one of the things that historical analysis makes possible.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand Anne Boleyn through the most rigorously researched account of her life and the evidence surrounding her fall, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn by Eric Ives.
So this is a scholarly biography that approaches the evidence with the rigor the subject deserves.
Ives is one of the most respected Tudor historians of the 20th century, and this book is considered the standard scholarly biography of Anne. It examines her life, her influence, and the political forces that led to her execution, while carefully separating historical evidence from the long-standing myths that have accumulated around her. The book addresses the charges against her directly and systematically, concluding that the evidence for guilt is not credible.
Is it accessible to readers without a prior background in Tudor history?
Ives writes for an academic audience, but with enough contextual clarity that an interested general reader can follow the argument without specialist knowledge. The book is detailed, but the detail is organized around a central question: what actually happened and why? That gives the research a consistent narrative drive. A reader who wants to understand Anne Boleyn through the evidence rather than through the legend will find it indispensable.
So it gives the reader the historical Anne, separated from the centuries of mythology that have surrounded her.
Precisely. And Ives is honest about what remains uncertain, which is itself a form of scholarly integrity that the subject demands.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
Anne Boleyn was executed on the 19th of May 1536 on Tower Green within the Tower of London. She was 35 years old or thereabouts. Henry VIII married Jane Seymour 11 days later. Jane Seymour produced the male heir that Anne had not, Edward VI, born in October 1537. Jane Seymour passed away shortly after the birth. The immediate legacy of Anne's execution was the continuation of a reign in which Henry's will encountered no institutional obstacle capable of resisting it. Two of his subsequent wives, Catherine Howard, would also be executed on charges of sexual misconduct. The pattern is not incidental. The machinery that had been built to dispose of Anne remained available, and was used again when the political circumstances made it convenient.
So the process created to remove Anne became a precedent for removing others.
Yes, the longer-term legacy is more complicated. Her daughter Elizabeth became queen in 1558 and reigned for 45 years. Producing what is often described as the golden age of English culture and political stability. The irony that the woman executed partly because she failed to produce a male heir gave birth to the monarch whose reign defined an era is not lost on historians. Elizabeth herself rarely spoke publicly of her mother, but the rehabilitation of Anne's reputation was implicitly connected to the legitimacy of Elizabeth's own claim. The cultural legacy of Anne Boleyn is substantial and complex. She has been continuously represented in fiction, drama, and popular culture since the 16th century, with the representation shifting across centuries in ways that reflect the concerns of the era producing it. In some periods, she is a scheming temptress who disrupted a legitimate marriage. In others, she is the romantic heroine who loved too boldly. In more recent treatment, she is increasingly examined as a politically capable and intellectually serious figure, who operated within and against the specific constraints of her position. The structural analysis her case invites is significant. The charges brought against her, adultery, incest, sexual misconduct, combined with political treason, represent a specific and recurring pattern in the political elimination of women who have gained power within systems not designed for their participation. Sexual and moral discrediting serves simultaneously to justify removal and to delegitimize any subsequent defense of the person removed. The same pattern appears in different forms across different historical periods and different institutional contexts.
So the specific mechanisms used against Anne are recognizable in other contexts, because they serve a function that recurs across different settings.
Yes, the role of narrative control in her case is equally instructive. Once the official account of Anne Boleyn as an adulterous and treasonous queen was established by the Henrician state, it became the default account for over 3 centuries. It required the patient work of modern historical scholarship, particularly the detailed archival research of Ives and others in the 20th century, to reconstruct an alternative account grounded in evidence rather than in the political interests of those who created the original narrative. This is characteristic of how official narratives work. They do not need to be true to be durable. They need only to be established by those with the authority to establish them, and the institutional capacity to enforce them. The truth of what happened to Anne Boleyn was available in the trial records and contemporary accounts from the beginning. It was simply not the account that those in power chose to circulate, and for centuries it was not the account that those without power had the resources to contest.
So, the suppression of her true story was itself an act of power that lasted for centuries.
Yes. And the modern relevance of this observation extends beyond the specific history of Tudor England. The mechanisms by which Anne Boleyn was removed, the construction of a narrative through sexual and moral accusation, the use of institutional processes to legitimize a predetermined outcome, the suppression of the share, alternative account by those controlling the channels of official communication, are not specific to the 16th century. They are structural features of how power operates when it has decided that a particular person must be eliminated, and needs a story to justify that decision. The condition that made Anne vulnerable was not her character, her intelligence, or her political judgment. It was the structural position she occupied, a woman whose position depended entirely on producing a male heir in a system where the capacity to produce an heir was not within her control, whose political influence derived entirely from the continued will of a single powerful man, whose legal standing could be revoked by the same institutional processes that had established it, was never secure in any meaningful sense. The brilliance of her rise made the mechanism of her fall harder to see, but it did not change the mechanism.
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the Tudor court, the political transformation she helped produce, the charges assembled in 3 weeks, and the narrative that took 3 centuries to begin to correct.
Anne Boleyn reminds us that when power decides the narrative, truth becomes secondary, and that the work of recovering it requires exactly the kind of patient, evidence-based inquiry that those who construct false narratives count on not occurring.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.